David, welcome to LSAT Unplugged.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much for joining. So I'm really excited to connect with you because I know that you have a wealth of experience in the law school admissions process. Do you want to share just a little bit about what you do and how you got into it?
Sure. So we started the company InGenius Prep when I was in my 1L year at Harvard Law. My partner Joel was in his 1L year at Yale Law, which was a stressful time to be starting a company. But we started out kind of helping students informally that had known that we were admitted. The application was something that people knew how much work we put into it, and were seeking our advice for things like their personal statements, supplemental essays, and so our JD division was the first division of the company that started because of our founders' backgrounds. But we very soon after that started our MD division for sorts of other graduates counseling, and now we have 10 offices worldwide.
Oh, wow, that's fantastic. And I understand that you have a lot of former admission officers on staff as well from law schools, right?
We do. We have about the numbers in flux, but we have about 182 former admissions officers, I think, from a variety of different programs, including former admissions officers on the JD and LLM side. Some schools combine those admissions offices. Some schools will separate them, but we have admissions officers from Harvard, Yale, Columbia, several other schools, including Gene Webb, who was the director of admissions at Yale Law School for 17 years.
Oh, wow, that's really something. So given your connections with all these admission officers, I know that you have a lot of advice to share, and I want to dive in and start giving applicants some of that advice. Just to start off, really simple, when should applicants start crafting their applications?
I think that applicants have to start thinking about building their candidacy from the time that they're in college, and if they're taking time off after college, at least 2 years in advance. That doesn't mean you need to be writing application materials then, but you need to be thinking of how you're crafting those materials. And I think some of the discussion we'll have later will tap into what you can actually be doing during that time. In terms of starting the actual application materials, usually the spring or summer before is when you want to start brainstorming different versions of your personal statement, and getting to work on some of your application work.
So what about personal statements specifically? When would you suggest brainstorming ideas versus going to final draft?
It's definitely an iterative process. So I know students who will start with little pieces of different ideas or anecdotes and try to blend them together. And that's a creative process that'll start from the spring or earlier for them. Most students really get going in earnest sometime in probably July or August, or some are even pushing it to September. You want to get your application in on a rolling basis as early as possible for the schools that are deciding on a rolling basis, but you obviously don't want to be submitting at a time where you're not presenting the most polished product that you can.
I'm glad you brought up the idea of the rolling process, because that is something I get a lot of questions about. Applicants know on average it's better to submit early, I imagine. But then what happens if, let's say, an applicant wants to retake the LSAT even in, let's say, November? What happens then?
So most schools aren't going to read your application until your file is complete. That being said, you have a complete application if you've submitted it with an LSAT score and are, if you're trying to retake, like you said, and submit that additional score, it's kind of in a gray area that depends on a particular school's policy. And that's where our former admissions officers help us out in telling us, okay, how exactly is this school going to be evaluating that? Because the answer that you might get publicly from a school about, a generic kind of rebuke, such as, oh, we're not going to look at everything and, we'll look at it once or not look at it again. I don't think that's actually the case. So for students that have their application materials finished, you don't want to be submitting on a rolling basis and have them make that decision quickly and have it be a negative one. So if you're in the ballpark of the medians and you want to take again to get even higher, that's something to consider. Generally not something that I will advise students to do on a wholesale basis, but definitely not just kind of submitting, knowing you have that other LSAT score coming in your back pocket in a couple of months. You want to make sure that you're presenting once as a general rule, just like the law schools will tell you publicly.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. Now, of course, LSAT and GPA are the biggest factors, But what about applicants who just can't get those numbers up? What's the biggest advice you would give them in terms of strengthening their applications?
Well, I think that so there's obviously the LSAT and GPA are the biggest factors, like you said, but I think the two that are most easily manipulated, and I don't mean that in a kind of gamesmanship sense, but I mean what you can actually change are your LSAT and your application materials. And some of it you can change, you can change what your essay topic is, what the theme of that essay is, how you write about certain things about yourself. But you can't change, just like for the GPA, the thought process for those years prior, where you're trying to figure out, okay, well, what type of law am I interested in? Why am I interested in law? All the types of questions that you want to answer in a personal statement. So the students that are either splitter candidates and have high GPA, low LSAT, or low LSAT, or vice versa, those candidates really need to rely on external validation of their ability. So some kind of great story about why they want to be in intellectual property law or in music copyright or maritime law, whatever that specific area is. I like to think of law not as a monolith, just like I like to think of students going to business school as not, you don't go study business. That's not really a thing. There's finance, accounting, entrepreneurship. Same thing with law. Most people aren't eager to go study civil procedure and figure out, the mechanics of filing a lawsuit. So it's about what you use the law for as a tool, and same thing with corporate law, although I don't know if I'm correct there. A lot of students maybe do just want to go make money and study corporate law. So it's about what kind of other subject area. I like to think in an interdisciplinary sense, how can you combine this with the law so that you're doing interesting extracurriculars that can then manifest themselves in your application and in your story, rather than just, oh, I was a paralegal, or I spent this entire summer studying for the LSAT or clerking. Those are things you need to do, especially the LSAT. But you don't need to clerk. You don't need to be a paralegal. Those are things that could help you figure out if you do actually want to be in the legal profession. But people try to kind of check them off as boxes that aren't really boxes you need to be checking off, and could risk making you look more standard than other applicants.
Right. Now, speaking of external validation, what about letters of recommendation?
Yeah, that's an excellent point. That's what I was going to talk about next. Is so if you think of LSAT and GPA, let's exclude the application for a second. If you're weak in one of those areas, you think of it like, I like to explain it to students like, okay, well, if you have a grade in school that's comprised of your final exams, your midterms, your homework, and participation, if you don't do well on your midterms, what do you have left? Well, the other three things. And so you can think of it a bit like a balancing equation, that if you don't do as well on your GPA, you want to make up for that by having a fantastic LSAT score and make sure you put extra work into that. If you're weak in both, frankly speaking, it's going to be difficult, but that doesn't mean that the game's over for you. You do want to find those external third ways, like the letter of recommendation fills a third-party knowledge gap. You as the applicant have told them interesting things and character attributes about yourself, and you've put yourself on reasonably level pegging with others in a standardized test, but maybe that recommender can give insight as to why your class was graded, without giving excuses, because you don't want to be giving these things, but how they know that the professors you took or the major you took at your school, they only give 1 or 2 A's or something like that. And it's notoriously difficult, and how you're a student who really went above and beyond to make sure you mastered the material. There are a lot of great things that someone could say about you. There are also, we talk about this a lot in the high school context, and it's less applicable for law school students, but there are still competitions and extracurricular activities like moot court, mock trial, things that you see a lot of. There are schools who specialize in this for students who want, like Houston, schools who train litigators, and those students will go there and compete at those schools. And if you are doing very well at that on a college level, that could be something that is attractive to a school for a law school. If you're nationally competitive, I see this a lot with high school debaters going to college as well. Obviously it's best if you have a great GPA and a great LSAT score, but if you're looking for an answer to that question, those are some of the things that you can try to control. Putting yourself in a position the last thing is that what the LSAT is supposed to do is equalize for a GPA. So it's putting you on level playing field with other applicants from other schools so that you're not comparing a GPA from Oklahoma and Yale. You have the LSAT to do that. So if you take that message and try to use that idea and say, okay, well, what opportunities can I have to go put myself in a place to compete with or be compared against other students of, that are going to be applicants to these schools and get some form of evaluation, then that's something that you can use as evidence, whether that's some kind of competition or mock trial or publication or letter of recommendation. Like one of the best students I know got into Yale Law School with a 167 LSAT, I think 4 or 5 years ago. And she had a great recommendation from a Yale law professor, because she was a research assistant for him. That's
really something. So I guess the biggest takeaway I'm getting from all of this is that providing them with some sort of objective measure, because the LSAT and GPA, they're numbers, they're objective. Obviously, there's grade inflation. Work experience is hard to parse. But if you're getting this comparison on the part of the recommender saying this person is relatively better than others in some way, or they won a competition, they stand out in some way, that does, at least there was some sort of independent third party evaluating the candidate.
Yeah, and that's, other than the LSAT and GPA, obviously, which are the truest objective forms of assessment here, everything else in the admissions process is fairly subjective, and things change from school to school in minor ways. So one of the goals that we work on with students is not just having ideas, and you could have a student who's really passionate about certain areas of law or ideas and things they talk about and think about and really put in the work, but don't ever take that last 5 or 10% to get that as a concrete achievement or something on paper that's objective. So whether it's a quantifiable metric like a test score or a competition win or something like that where you've placed or ranked, even with the more subjective sounding things like activities that you do, trying to quantify in an activity list or a resume how you've actually participated in that and what you've done, such that you can be compared, like you said, for the letter of recommendation context. That's really important for students.
Fantastic. Thanks for sharing, David. So just to leave off for one moment here, we've talked about getting into top law schools with top GPA, top LSAT, or other third-party independent criteria. What if someone is not going to get into the top 14? They just don't have the numbers, don't have the resume. Are there any particular standout legal programs that students might want to look into?
I think the first thing to look at is, a lot of students, I know that in this industry, we look at, T14 on a lot of forums and blogs. People talk about T14. I don't really know why the 14 ever became the cutoff. That's a little strange to me. I think that there are plenty of schools that are wiggling in and out of that bottom of that range that are fairly good. So beyond that quibble, and beyond those fewer, I kind of think of it like Premier League soccer, where there's teams getting relegated at the bottom and coming back in and kind of on a rotating basis. But beyond that, I think that there are schools that specialize in certain areas of law. Most students that I talk to don't really have that specialty, though, and so aren't really ready, or I wouldn't advise them to pigeonhole themselves at that time. So the advice I would give is there are a lot of students who will say, all right, so I grew up in Florida, and I talk to a lot of people who say, well, I'd much rather, if I were working in Orlando, have a University of Florida law degree than I would have a Harvard law degree. And some people could think that's facetious, but alumni communities are extremely important. And when every top lawyer in the area comes from your school, that can really matter. I have a friend who went to LSU for law school, and he works in Baton Rouge, and that's where everyone went to law school there, and one or two other local regional schools. So this is something I see a little bit less pronounced, but still on the West Coast. If you're going to be in law school in UCLA or Berkeley or Stanford, Stanford's maybe a little different, and those are all very high-ranking schools, but there are plenty of examples of law schools in the area where if you're going to practice in San Francisco or LA or wherever the location is, it makes more sense for your career if you're going to be in that area, your family lives there, or there's a locus of a particular industry there, right? So if you're in Houston and you want to do oil and gas law or something, then that's something that can help you either with a regional specialty or a subject area specialty. But I advise students to stay away from the subject area specialty, just because generally an incoming 1L doesn't know anything about law school other than what they teach in first year of law school.
Right, but there's definitely something to the regional aspect that I think I definitely want students to keep in mind. There's a lot of truth to that.
A lot of people will just come to me and look at a median chart and say, I can't get into this or that school, and I first of all, that's a lot of the times not true. But they also, you can look at different rankings regionally. And if you don't want to rely on rankings as just a kind of an introduction for you, you can talk to people who practice in that area, look up the top firms, look at their bios on their webpage, see where they went to law school.
Right. Awesome, David. Thank you for sharing all this great advice for my audience today. What's the best way for applicants to get in touch with you if they're interested in potentially working with you and your team at InGenius?
You could email us at info@ingeniusprep.com. You could also visit our website, www.ingeniusprep.com, and sign up for a free consultation to talk to one of our admissions experts about how we might be able to help you, whether you're a couple years out and just thinking about it for kind of candidacy building services and advice, or actually in the application process now.
Awesome. Thanks again for taking the time, David. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for tuning into the show. Please subscribe if you haven't done so already to be notified of new episodes as I release them. And feel free to reach out if you need anything at all as you move forward with your prep. I'm happy to help however I can. In the meantime, I'll wish you all the best and take care.